Imagine sitting on a toilet and wiping yourself with a sponge that dozens of strangers have used before you. Sounds horrifying, right? Well, welcome to ancient Rome, the civilization that built aqueducts, roads, and empires, but could not grasp the basics of personal hygiene. So, grab your pillow and blanket and relax your mind. Let the story unfold as we dive deep into the shocking, gross, and unbelievable hygiene habits of one of history's greatest civilizations. Before we start, if you genuinely enjoy my work, please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to know what time are you watching this video. Imagine walking into a public toilet, not just any toilet, but one built out of stone with a long bench stretching along the wall. You look around. There are no walls, no privacy, and no doors to close. You sit beside strangers, maybe a baker, a soldier, or an old fisherman. The air is thick, moist. You hear voices, laughter, the occasional grunt, and then you look down. There at your feet is a small bucket. Floating inside is a stick. Attached to it, a sponge. And that sponge, someone else just used it on their backside. And now it sits your turn. This wasn't a nightmare. This was daily life for citizens of the mighty Roman Empire, a civilization praised for its power, elegance, and unmatched innovation. But beneath its marble pillars and golden statues lurked some of the most disgusting, unhygienic practices you could possibly imagine. Ancient Rome, a name that conjures images of philosophers in togas, proud generals riding on horseback, and vast, gleaming cities under the sun. Their civilization was advanced in many ways. They gave us aqueducts, paved roads, central heating, and the early versions of newspapers and concrete. Their architecture still stands as a marvel. Their political systems inspired nations. Their language shaped the foundations of law and science. But for all their progress, for all their supposed enlightenment, the Romans lived in filth, and worse, they didn't even know it. Take those public toilets, for example. Known as latrines, they were scattered throughout the empire. Open, communal spaces where men and women would sit side by side to relieve themselves. There were no flush buttons, no privacy stalls, not even a courtesy curtain. Just stone benches with round holes carved into them, and beneath those holes, a flowing channel of wastewater. The idea was brilliant in its engineering. Running water beneath the seats carried away the waste, using the city's aqueduct systems. But then came the part that most people today would struggle to believe: the way they cleaned themselves. There was no toilet paper in ancient Rome. Instead, they had the tersorium, a wooden stick with a sea sponge tied to the end. After doing their business, a Roman citizen would dip the tersorium into a bucket of vinegar or salt water, give it a quick rinse, and then use it to clean themselves. Once finished, they'd return the sponge to the communal bucket, ready for the next person. Yes, you heard that right. They reused the same sponge over and over, day after day, stranger after stranger. Imagine the bacteria, the diseases, the infections. It's no wonder historians believe Roman latrines may have been breeding grounds for illness. The vinegar and brine may have helped kill some germs, but not nearly enough to make it safe. In fact, ancient parasites like whipworm and roundworm have been found in latrine soil samples from Roman sites, offering silent, rotting proof of just how filthy things really were. Yet to the Romans, this wasn't disgusting. This was normal, routine. They believed the vinegar was enough. They believed their advanced water systems and marble bathhouses kept them clean. But when you look closer, the truth is far less glamorous. Public bathhouses were another cornerstone of Roman life. Every major city had them. Some were free, some were luxurious, but all of them were crowded. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of people bathed together. They'd soak in large pools, sweat in hot steam rooms, and scrub themselves clean. Except their version of scrubbing was rather different too. Romans didn't use soap. Instead, they'd cover their bodies in oil, often olive oil mixed with herbs or perfumes. Then they'd scrape the oil off using a curved metal tool called a strigil. This scraped off the oil along with sweat, dirt, and dead skin. But the problem? Those strigils were sometimes shared, and the bathwater rarely changed. So while the upper classes bathed in marble halls under frescoed ceilings, their bodies mingled in the same oily, dirty water. It may have smelled sweet with rose petals and incense, but beneath the surface it was a swamp of human debris. Now step into the sandals of an average Roman citizen. You're waking up in a tenement building, a tall, rickety structure known as an insula. You live on the upper floor. There's no running water up here, no toilets, no kitchens. You carry your water up in buckets. You use a chamber pot at night, and when it's full, you dump it into the street below. This wasn't rare. It was daily life. Roman streets often ran with filth, chamber pots, animal waste and garbage all mixed together in the heat of the Mediterranean sun. The smell was overwhelming, and yet people walked through it, worked beside it, sold food from carts in the middle of it. Even the great Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, couldn't keep up. It was one of the most advanced systems of its time, channeling waste out of the city and into the Tiber River. But in poorer areas, especially in the slums, sewage simply pooled in the streets or alleys. And if you think your shoes would protect you, think again. Romans often wore sandals, open, flimsy, barely more than a strip of leather. Their feet were caked with filth by the end of the day. Infection was common. Sores, cuts, and blisters were a part of life. And still, they believed themselves clean. To understand how such an advanced civilization could live like this, you have to understand how they viewed cleanliness. For the Romans, bathing wasn't just about hygiene, it was a social ritual, a place to meet, to talk, to do business. Cleanliness was more about appearance than health. Smelling good mattered more than staying germ-free, and of course they had no idea what a germ even was. Medicine was primitive. Disease was blamed on bad air, angry gods, or imbalances of bodily fluids. There were no microscopes, no antibiotics, no concept of bacteria, so when illness spread, and it often did, people looked for signs in the stars, not in their sponges. Even their dental habits, by today's standards, were horrifying. Some used powdered bones or oyster shells to clean their teeth. Others swished vinegar or even stale urine in their mouths, believing it could whiten their smiles. And yes, urine was commonly used in Roman society. It was collected in jars, sold, and used to wash clothes. The ammonia in the urine helped clean fabric, they said. Imagine the smell of a laundry shop in ancient Rome. But perhaps the most disturbing part is this. To the Romans, this was civilization. This was progress. This was the height of human achievement. And in many ways they were right. Rome built cities, roads, temples, and systems that outlived the empire itself. They created art, literature, philosophy, and law. Their language echoes in every courtroom and classroom today. Yet for all their triumphs, they couldn't escape the filth of their daily lives. The sponge in the bucket, the oil-slicked bathwater, the sewage in the street. It was all part of their version of normal. History tends to romanticize the past. We imagine togas flowing through sunlit forums, golden laurel wreaths resting on wise brows. We think of chariots, heroes, epic speeches. But real life in ancient Rome was much more human, messy, dirty, and shockingly disgusting. So the next time you flush a toilet, wash your hands, or brush your teeth, think back to the Roman citizen, squatting in a marble latrine, reaching into that shared vinegar bucket, and be grateful for modern plumbing. It's easy to admire ancient civilizations for their genius, but when you peel back the layers, when you look beyond the marble and the myths, you find a very different picture. You find a world of shared sponges and oily water, a world of disease and misunderstanding, a world where the most basic act of going to the bathroom was a gamble with your health. Yet perhaps that's what makes history so fascinating. Not just the glory, but the grime. not just the victories but the vulgar, because it reminds us that civilization has always been a work in progress, that even the mightiest empires had their dirty little secrets. And some of them were soaked in vinegar. Close your eyes and imagine yourself standing in the heart of ancient Rome. The year is 120 AD. The city is alive, buzzing with the energy of over 1 million souls. Crowds shuffle through narrow stone streets lined with towering insulae, multi-story apartment blocks that lean slightly inward, casting long shadows over vendors, beggars, senators, and slaves alike. The air carries the scent of roasted lamb, spiced wine, and something else: dirt, sweat, smoke. Life here is loud, unpredictable, and glorious. You walk past towering marble temples built in honor of mighty gods: Jupiter, Mars, Venus. You hear the echoing chants of priests and the rhythmic stomp of Roman legionaries returning from campaigns. You pass beneath aqueducts, those majestic arches that carry fresh water from distant springs across valleys and hillsides, straight into the beating heart of the city. To many, this was the height of human achievement. A civilization so powerful, so organized, and so ahead of its time that even today we borrow their words, their laws, and their architecture. They had courts and lawyers, newspapers carved in stone, libraries, postal services, and even fast food stalls. Their calendar shapes ours. Their military conquered vast empires, from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south. Their roads stretched like veins across continents, straight and strong, some still used to this day. They built great forums where philosophers debated the nature of life, death, and virtue. They raised massive colosseums where 50,000 people could gather to watch gladiators clash, animals roar, and emperors deliver justice with a turn of the thumb. They engineered public spaces with central heating, underfloor systems called hypocausts that warmed rooms from beneath the ground. And above all, they brought water, clean, constant, and controlled. Water that flowed from mountains, guided by stone into fountains, homes, and massive public bathhouses. In the bathhouses, rich and poor mingled together. There were pools of hot water, cold water, warm water, and steam rooms thick with humidity. Men would gather to scrub their skin, gossip, discuss politics, and plan business deals. Women had their own spaces, their own times. It was here that the Roman obsession with cleanliness revealed itself, or so it seemed. The scale of their infrastructure was unmatched. Rome had over 1,000 public fountains and hundreds of public toilets. They built sewer systems that drained entire neighborhoods, systems like the Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest and largest sewers in the world. Markets flourished under the protection of Roman law. The fire brigade, the police force, the treasury, all existed in some form. It was, to the outside eye, a civilization so grand and structured that one might assume nothing could go wrong. But beneath this brilliance, hidden beneath the stone and marble, under the bathwater and perfume, was a darker, filthier reality. Rome was beautiful, but it was not clean. The streets that hosted processions and parades were often piled high with human waste, rotting food, and animal carcasses. Tenement buildings, the insulae, were stacked 6 to 7 stories high, with no plumbing above the ground floor. Chamber pots were dumped from windows into the alleys below. The sound of liquid splashing wasn't always rain. The sewer systems did exist, yes, but many homes weren't connected to them. In poorer districts, waste pooled and festered, and the Tiber River, once a source of pride and purity, became choked with refuse, blood from butcher shops, and effluents from tanneries and dyeing houses. Even the bathhouses, those gleaming halls of marble and steam, were not as sanitary as they seemed. Romans didn't use soap. They slathered their skin in oil, then scraped it off with a curved metal blade called a strigil. The oil collected sweat, grime, and dead skin. And the pools, those were rarely drained. Bathers floated in the same water day after day, often without knowing what floated with them. Infections spread, skin conditions festered. The more crowded the bathhouse, the filthier the waters became. But perhaps the strangest of all was the Roman toilet culture. Latrines were public, open, and communal. People sat next to each other on long stone benches with carved holes. There were no partitions, no privacy. Conversation was common. Laughter echoed off stone walls, and it wasn't unusual to make eye contact with someone as you did your business. And when you were done, you used the tersorium, a sponge tied to the end of a stick, soaking in a bucket of vinegar or salt water. One sponge, shared by everyone, dipped, used, returned. Some say the vinegar was enough to kill germs, but the concept of germs didn't exist. Parasites like whipworm, roundworm, and dysentery spread easily through these shared tools. The toilets themselves were rarely cleaned. Sometimes they overflowed, sometimes rats crawled up through the pipes. Occasionally, flames would shoot up from the sewer gas igniting beneath the latrine seats. Some Romans believed demons lived in the toilets. Others simply ignored the danger. But in their eyes, they were clean. They smelled of scented oils and bathed daily. They had aqueducts and fountains. They believed they were the most civilized people in the world, and in many ways they were. Yet disease haunted them. Outbreaks of plague, mysterious fevers, skin infections, intestinal parasites. These were common. Infant mortality was high. Life expectancy hovered around 30 to 35 years. Even the elite could not escape the dangers. Wealth might buy you a private bath, but not immunity. Their medicine was steeped in superstition. Doctors used leeches. Bloodletting was a cure for almost anything. Some believed headaches were caused by evil spirits and treated them with drills to the skull. They had herbs, yes, and poultices, and sometimes even accurate diagnoses. But without the knowledge of bacteria or proper sterilization, most surgeries ended in infection. Even something as simple as a toothache could kill. Still, Rome endured. Its people adapted. They invented. They conquered. And they wrote history from their own perspective. When we read about ancient Rome, we often read the polished version, the version carved into stone and copied by scholars, the version that speaks of triumph, discipline, glory, the version that shows the emperor at the peak of a marble staircase, looking down on a city of splendor. But the real Rome, it was layered, complicated, a mixture of brilliance and ignorance, of genius and filth. And that's what makes it fascinating. Rome gave the world law, architecture, language, and ideas that still resonate today. But it also gave us a glimpse into how even the most organized, most successful civilization can live in the shadows of its own filth, how intelligence and innovation can exist side by side with rot, disease, and decay. It's a reminder that history is never simple. No civilization is perfect, and sometimes behind the marble columns and golden statues, behind the philosophers and poets, lies a world that is far more human and far more disgusting. So if you ever find yourself admiring the grandeur of Rome, imagining what it might have been like to walk its crowded streets, to dine in its taverns, to soak in its baths, just remember this. As you stood in that bathhouse, scraping oil from your skin, 1,000 others did the same. As you reached for that sponge in the toilet, so did 100 strangers. As you walked the streets in your fine tunic, you stepped over puddles of waste. Civilization is not always as clean as it seems. And in Romesip's case, it never really was. Imagine walking down a bustling Roman street. The sun warms the cobblestones beneath your sandals. People pass by in woolen tunics. Merchants shout their prices. Children dart between carts filled with fruit, bread, and olives. The scent of garlic, roasted meat, and crushed grapes drifts through the air, but it mingles with something else, something sour, earthy, a little too human. You follow the scent until you find it. A small stone building, not much to look at, just another room in the endless grid of Rome. But inside it's different. Inside, there is no shopkeeper, no shrine, no goods for sale. Inside, you'll find a bench, a very long bench. It stretches along the wall in a perfect line, carved from smooth stone, warm from the afternoon sun. And in this bench, holes, round ones, evenly spaced. There's no mistaking what it's for. This is a public latrine, a toilet. But not like any toilet you've seen before. There are no partitions, no doors, no stalls, just a line of holes and people, men and women, rich and poor, senators and slaves. They sit beside one another, shoulder to shoulder, robes gathered around their waists, legs planted on the stone floor, having conversations while relieving themselves. To us, it feels shocking, strange, almost absurd. But to the Romans, this was perfectly normal. It wasn't just tolerated, it was accepted, expected, a part of daily life. They didn't see it as disgusting. In fact, the latrine was often a social space, a place where neighbours caught up on news, debated politics, made jokes, or shared gossip. Some archaeologists believe people even conducted business deals inside these stone-walled bathrooms. You might enter to relieve yourself and leave with a contract, a job, or a new friend. And all of this while doing something we consider deeply private. Imagine sitting beside a baker who's just finished kneading dough for the day. To your other side, a retired centurion discusses grain prices with a wine merchant. All three of you are engaged in conversation, while your waste drops into the same water channel beneath your feet. Because that's how it worked. Beneath the holes in the bench, a shallow channel of water flowed. It moved constantly, pushed by the Roman aqueducts that fed the city. This water was meant to carry the waste away, out through the sewer systems, eventually into the Tiber River. It was one of the earliest forms of sanitation infrastructure, and in many ways it worked surprisingly well for its time. But it was far from perfect. The water wasn't always clean. In some places it stagnated, in others it backed up, and the sewers themselves, full of rats, bugs, and methane gas. There are records of sewer gas igniting and flames shooting out from the toilet holes, startling, to say the least. Some Romans believed that demons lived beneath the latrines, waiting to strike the careless. Superstitions grew. People whispered about curses, hauntings, and strange illnesses that followed those who sat too long. And yet, they kept using them. Because the Roman toilet was not just a necessity, it was a symbol of civilization, proof that they were better than the so-called barbarians who squatted in the woods or buried their waste in the sand. Rome, they believed, had conquered not only people and land, but nature itself. With running water, aqueducts, and communal toilets, they believed they had tamed the most basic human functions. But there were no toilet seats, no paper, no privacy. And then there was the sponge. The tersorium, as it was called, was a wooden stick with a sea sponge tied to the end. After finishing their business, a Roman citizen would reach for the communal sponge, dip it into a bucket of vinegar or salt water, and use it to clean themselves. Then they'd rinse it briefly and place it back for the next person to use. A single sponge, shared by dozens, sometimes hundreds in a single day. To us, the idea is unthinkable. But again, they didn't know what we know. Germs, bacteria, cross-contamination. These concepts didn't exist in the Roman mind. They believed vinegar was a cleanser, that salt water killed odours, that if it smelled sharp it was clean. And so the sponge passed from hand to hand, person to person, rear to rear. It was just another part of the experience. Some latrines had elegant mosaics, decorative floors and painted walls. Others were dark, musty, built beneath the streets. Rich neighbourhoods had more lavish facilities. Poorer districts had more crowded ones. But the structure remained the same. A bench, a water channel, and a bucket of vinegar. For women, the experience was no different. In some places, men and women shared the same latrines. In others, they had separate times of day. Modesty wasn't enforced the way we imagine it. Clothing was practical, privacy less so. There was no flushing, no air freshener, no hand soap. And yet people spent time here, sometimes longer than needed. It wasn't just a stop on the way to something else. It was a gathering place. There are records of poets referencing the latrines. Satirists joked about the things they overheard while sitting on the toilet. Graffiti scratched into the stone walls told crude jokes, political slogans, or romantic confessions. Some latrines even had attendants, slaves, or workers who maintained the buckets, brought fresh vinegar, or helped older citizens manage their clothing. You didn't go to the toilet alone. You went with your neighbor, with your father, with your children. Some even brought instruments to play, food to eat. Yes, people snacked in Roman toilets. The experience was raw, honest, human, but it wasn't set clean. Parasites thrived. Fecal-oral transmission was common. Outbreaks of dysentery and typhoid could sweep through neighborhoods, and though the water channels moved waste away, they also spread contamination. One bucket of dirty vinegar was not enough to kill everything hiding in the sponge. Still, the Romans were proud of their system. They considered it part of their greatness, something that separated them from the primitive tribes they conquered. To build a toilet was to build order. To control water was to control nature. And in that belief, they weren't entirely wrong. Rome did something no civilization before it had done at such scale. It built shared infrastructure. It provided access. It said, no matter your status, you can come here. You can sit. You can be part of the city. Rich or poor, you shared the same sponge. But over time, the cracks in the system widened. As the empire stretched too far, as money thinned and enemies grew bolder, the maintenance of public works faltered. Aqueducts broke, sewers clogged, toilets overflowed, and where there had once been dignity and design, there was now decay and disease. The latrines tell a story not just of sanitation, but of society. They were places where walls didn't exist, where rank mattered less, where the most personal acts became public, where the illusion of Roman superiority sat, quite literally on a hole in a stone bench. And in that way they search strangely beautiful, because they remind us that even in the greatest civilizations, the most basic needs remain the same: hunger, thirst, sleep, and the need to go. No matter how high the marble columns, no matter how vast the empire, every Roman emperor or slave had to sit side by side and do what humans have always done. In the quiet hum of the latrine, between splashes and murmured voices, between the vinegar sponge and the flowing channel of water, that is where the real Rome lived. Not just in the Senate or the Colosseum or the battlefield, but here, on a bench, in a room, surrounded by strangers, going together. Just like always, imagine this. You've just finished a long walk through the narrow stone alleys of ancient Rome. The afternoon sun has warmed the walls of the city, and the smell of bread, sweat, livestock, and smoke wraps around you like an invisible cloak. Your sandals are covered in dust, and your mind is occupied with errands. Maybe you're heading to the market, or to see a friend, or perhaps to catch a glimpse of the chariots racing at the Circus Maximus. But something stirs in your stomach, a slow, familiar pressure, a subtle signal that it's time to stop. So, like thousands of others, you find your way to the nearest public latrine. These are easy to find. They're scattered throughout the city, dark little rooms built from stone, some plain, some grand, tucked into walls or standing alone, depending on the neighborhood. You step inside and are greeted not by solitude, but by conversation. This is no private stall. There are no doors, no walls between you and the others. Just a smooth stone bench that runs along the perimeter of the room. In the bench, a series of evenly spaced holes. Some are already occupied. Merchants, laborers, travelers, and even children sit comfortably, chatting, grunting, laughing as they do what nature requires. You take a seat, and in doing so you've joined a tradition that spans generations. You glance down. Beneath the holes is a shallow water channel, always flowing, carrying away the city's waste. This, you think, is progress. This is order. Rome is powerful. Rome is clean. You finish your business and then you need to clean yourself. And that sips when you see it. The tersorium. To most, this object means nothing. It looks simple, harmless, even. A sponge, soft, porous, yellowish in colour, tied to the end of a slender wooden stick. It rests in a shallow stone basin or clay pot, soaking in a pool of liquid. But this is no ordinary sponge. This is the tool every Roman uses after using the toilet, a universal instrument, a public utility, a shared secret of cleanliness. You pick it up. The wood is smooth in your hand, worn from years of use. The sponge is damp, dripping slightly. It smells of vinegar, sharp, acidic, familiar. You use it carefully. Then you rinse it back in the same bucket and place it down for the next person. This is the tersorium, the Roman solution to toilet paper, and in their eyes, it was brilliant. But what if we looked closer? What if we stepped beyond the routine, beyond the casual acceptance, and truly saw what was happening here? The tersorium was used by everyone, rich or poor, citizen or slave. In homes, if you were wealthy enough to have a latrine, you might have your own sponge, but in public latrines, of which there were many, it was communal, one sponge, one stick, for dozens, sometimes hundreds of users per day. The liquid in which it was placed varied, often vinegar, sometimes brine, a salty solution believed to cleanse and purify. There were no disinfectants in the modern sense, no antibacterial soaps, no awareness of bacteria at all. Germ theory was still 2,000 years away. The Romans believed that what stung the nose killed disease, and vinegar stung sharply. They were proud of this method. They considered it civilized, efficient, better than the barbaric customs of tribes beyond their borders, who used leaves or dirt or nothing at all. The tersorium was, in a way, a symbol of progress. But as time passed, and as archaeologists dug deeper into the ruins of Rome, what they found told a darker story. Soil samples taken from ancient latrines revealed something the Romans could never have known: parasites. Lots of them, whipworms, roundworms, tapeworms. The microscopic signatures of diseases passed through fecal matter, evidence of poor sanitation, poor hygiene, and likely shared tools. The tersorium, soaked though it was in vinegar, did not cleanse as thoroughly as the Romans believed. And yet, they kept using it. Some latrines had dozens of sponge sticks, placed in jars or hung on walls. Some were maintained by attendants, often slaves whose job was to refill the vinegar, replace the sponges when they wore out, and keep the latrine in order. But there was no real cleaning, no boiling, no scrubbing, no separation of the used and unused. It was all done in plain sight. Imagine now the daily rhythm of it. A man wakes before sunrise, dons his tunic, steps through the misty streets to the nearest latrine. The city hums with energy even in the early hours. He walks in, greets another man already seated, nods politely. They exchange a few words, perhaps about politics or the weather or last night's wine. They finish. They use the same sponge. They go on with their day. Another woman arrives. A servant, perhaps. She waits her turn, then takes her place. The tersorium is still wet, still warm. She doesn't flinch. She uses it, rinses it, and moves on. This object, this unremarkable stick, was a part of life. Quiet, essential, unnoticed. Like the turning of a wheel, it kept the machine of daily routine moving. And because of that, no one questioned it. It was simply how things were done. But now, with the knowledge we have, it becomes something else entirely, something fascinating, unsettling, even horrifying. Imagine the build-up of disease. The invisible threats, the silent spread of illness. How many infections started not from war or famine, but from a shared sponge dipped in vinegar? We often imagine history as a string of great battles, famous speeches, glittering temples, and towering statues. But more often, history lives in the ordinary, in the forgotten, in objects like the tersorium, tools used not for glory but for survival. There is something deeply human about the tersorium. It speaks to our eternal desire to solve problems, to improve upon nature, to make even the most unpleasant parts of life a little more manageable. It also speaks to our limits, to the ways in which even intelligent, organized societies can miss the invisible dangers beneath the surface. Because Rome was not ignorant. Rome was thoughtful. They built aqueducts to carry clean water for miles. They constructed latrines with water channels to remove waste. They created systems, rules, patterns, but they didn't know what they couldn't see. And so the sponge on the stick became both solution and source. It's strange, isn't it, that something so small could carry such weight. Today we flush a button, and it's done. We never think of what comes next. Our systems are invisible. Our hygiene, private. We have walls, stalls, fans, sprays, soap. We live in a world that hides what it deems unclean. But the Romans didn't hide. They didn't cover or separate. They built their latrines as open rooms, like dining halls for the body's final course. They used their sponge proudly. They passed it down, and in doing so they left behind a history not written in marble, but in the humble shape of a wooden stick with a sponge tied to its end. Some tersoria have been found in ruins, still intact after centuries, hardened by time, brittle with age. When held in a museum behind glass, they appear harmless again, a relic, a curiosity, something we can laugh at or be shocked by. But in their time they were as common as sandals. This is what makes history real, not the grand speeches or carved legends, but the soft, wet sponge left in a vinegar jar at the foot of a stone bench, used by someone just like us, someone with plans and worries, someone who lived in one of the most advanced civilizations the world had ever seen. And so, the next time you hear the name Rome, when you think of Caesar or the Colosseum of marble pillars and bronze statues, remember also the latrine, the water channel, the sponge, and how, in a city of 1,000,000 souls, cleanliness came not from paper or porcelain, but from a simple stick, passed hand to hand, one bottom at a time. History is not just built from greatness. It is built from grime, from the strange, the forgotten, the quietly revolting, and in those hidden corners we see ourselves most clearly. Because even the most powerful people have to wipe. And in Rome they all used the same sponge. It was always damp. That's the first thing you would notice. The sponge, tied to a stick and resting in a clay jar or stone basin, was never dry. The vinegar-scented water it soaked in gave off a sharp, stinging smell, one that bit at the nose and lingered in the throat. It was an old smell, the kind you couldn't forget even if you wanted to, and it meant only one thing. Someone had used it before you. And in Rome, there was no telling who that someone might have been. Every day, thousands of people across the Roman Empire used the same solution for one of the most private yet necessary parts of life, not just in Rome itself, but in towns and cities scattered across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. In public latrines, those long, echoing rooms lined with stone benches and open holes, people gathered not just to relieve themselves, but to talk, to argue, to laugh. They sat side by side, without shame or secrecy. But when it came time to clean up, they reached for a single tool, a simple sponge tied to a wooden stick, soaked in vinegar or salt water, the tersorium. This wasn't a personal item. It wasn't yours. It belonged to everyone who entered the latrine that day. And if you had to go, you didn't have a choice. You picked it up, you used it, and then you placed it back, still wet, still used for the next person. There was no system to track who used it first or last or how many times it had been rinsed. There were no signs, no warnings, no instructions. It sat there in the open, like a silent witness to everything that passed through those walls. Imagine reaching for that sponge. You hesitate for a second, but not long, because hesitation means awkwardness, and awkwardness didn't belong in Roman latrines. Everyone used it. Everyone knew the routine, and if you questioned it, if you stepped back in disgust, someone nearby might raise an eyebrow, maybe even laugh. This was normal, and normal things didn't get questioned. But the truth is, for all of Rome's brilliance, for all its roads and aqueducts, its temples and laws, its hygiene practices hid a creeping danger, one that couldn't be seen or smelled or scraped off with vinegar: parasites, disease, infection. We know now what the Romans couldn't have imagined, that the same sponge passed from hand to hand was also passing something else. Microscopic threats that clung to the sponge's porous surface, that burrowed into the next user's skin, that slipped into their bloodstream, their intestines, their lungs. In the soil beneath ancient latrines, scientists today have found the eggs of whipworms, roundworms, and other intestinal parasites, left behind in the waste of people who once sat shoulder to shoulder, sharing stories and sponges. And those people, those everyday Romans, probably had no idea. To them, illness came from bad air, angry gods, or an imbalance of fluids in the body, not from a wooden stick, not from the thing they all used. Think of how quickly it must have spread. A single infected person uses the sponge. The vinegar, though strong in scent, fails to kill everything. The next person picks it up, uses it. Their skin absorbs more than just moisture. Maybe within days they feel ill, but they don't suspect the sponge. No one does. After all, they used it too. In the homes of the wealthy, things were only slightly better. Rich families sometimes had private latrines and their own tersorium, but private still didn't mean personal. Slaves often cleaned the facilities. Sometimes the same sponge was used for the whole household. No one boiled it. No one sterilized it. They just trusted that vinegar was enough. And when that sponge wore out, when it began to tear or grow stiff with age, it was replaced, but not discarded with ceremony. It wasn't buried or burned. It was just thrown away or tossed into the sewer, where it joined the rest of the city's filth. You have to wonder how many people ever thought about it. How many truly looked at the sponge and imagined where it had been, who had touched it, what it had carried? Probably not many. Because when something is normal, it becomes invisible, even when it's horrifying. That's what makes the story of the Roman sponge so strange. It's not a tale of evil or cruelty or deliberate neglect. It's a story of assumptions, of blind trust, of what happens when everyone follows the same routine without asking why, and isn't set that the story of civilization itself. We look back at Rome with awe. Their roads are still here, their buildings still stand, their language shaped the world. But this little detail, this humble, reused sponge, tells a different story, one not of greatness, but of vulnerability. The vulnerability of trusting what you can't see, of believing that something that smells strong must be clean, of sitting down in a row of strangers, talking about the weather, and never once thinking that the thing you're about to touch could be the thing that makes you sick. In some ways, it sits deeply human to follow the crowd, to accept what sept's given, to do what everyone else does, even when it means using a sponge someone else used again and again and again. There are modern parallels, of course, times when we believe we're clean, safe, protected, only to learn later that the danger was always there, invisible, waiting, passed not through violence but through habit. That's the eerie power of the tersorium. Not that it existed, but that it was accepted. That it became so common, so mundane, that no one questioned it. Even today, When we think of Roman baths and latrines, we focus on the engineering, the running water, the smooth benches carved into stone, the aqueducts that fed the fountains, the toilets, the sewers, and rightly so. It was an incredible achievement, a leap forward in urban living. But in the middle of it all sat the sponge, soaked in vinegar, tied to a stick, waiting for the next hand. Some Roman writers joked about the latrines. They wrote about the sounds and smells, the conversations overheard between bowel movements. They laughed at the idea of a man slipping while trying to balance himself, or a rat emerging from the sewer mid-sentence. But rarely did they question the hygiene. That part was invisible. That part was normal. So is Sir left with this image. A dark stone room. A line of people sitting silently, or talking, or groaning, or chuckling. Water trickles beneath them, carrying waste to places unseen. And at the centre of it all, like a quiet participant in their daily lives, rests the sponge. So small, so ordinary, and yet used by everyone, shared by everyone, trusted by everyone, even as it helps spread illness in ways no one could understand. That's the thing about history. We imagine it as distant, full of people who thought differently, lived differently. But in moments like this, in the quiet act of reaching for a reused sponge, we find ourselves staring into a mirror. We see our routines, our assumptions, our blind spots, because the people who sat on those benches weren't strange. They were normal, ordinary. They lived in a world that told them what to do, and they did it, just like we do. So the next time you wash your hands or flush a toilet or unwrap a roll of toilet paper, pause just for a second and remember the sponge, the one soaked in vinegar, the one used by everyone, the one that passed from hand to hand in a civilization that conquered the world but never questioned the simplest thing. And maybe that's the real lesson, that progress doesn't always mean understanding, that even the most advanced empires can miss what's right beneath them, and that sometimes what connects us across centuries is the thing we all sit on, and the sponge we all share. They never questioned it. Not once. Not the sponge, not the stick, not the vinegar it sat in. For centuries, this simple, soggy tool rested in the corner of nearly every Roman latrine, soaking in sharp-smelling liquid, passed from hand to hand, bottom to bottom, with complete and utter trust. And why wouldn't they trust it? It stung the nose, after all. It smelled clean. That sour, biting scent of vinegar meant something to the Romans. It meant purity, protection, power over odour, and in a world before science, before microscopes, before soap, smell was everything. They believed that if something smelled sharp, it could chase away illness. If it masked the scent of decay, it must have destroyed the cause. So the sponge, dipped again and again in vinegar or salt water, seemed like a smart sanitary solution. No one paused to ask, but what if that sip's not enough? No one could, because no one knew what they were fighting. To be fair, it's hard to blame them. The Roman Empire in so many ways was a marvel of human achievement. Its cities were planned, its water systems ran for miles. Its engineers carved stone like it was clay. They built heated floors, domed roofs, aqueducts, and even plumbing. They had rules for sanitation, inspectors, penalties for those who dumped filth in the wrong place. But they didn't have germs. Not in their minds. Not in their language. Not even as a concept. To them, disease came from the air, or from the gods, or from bad behaviour, or imbalance, or spoiled food. The idea that something too small to see could hitch a ride on a sponge and slip quietly into the body, that idea would have sounded like madness. So they trusted what they did understand. Vinegar, salt, tradition. If your father did it, and your grandfather before him, and the magistrate next door, and the priest at the temple, and even the emperor's steward, then surely it must be right. Surely a sponge soaked in vinegar, must be clean. It wasn't set just the sponge either. The Romans used vinegar for almost everything. They drank it diluted with water. They poured it on wounds. They cooked with it, cleaned with it, soaked their feet in it. It was both a tonic and a cleanser, a perfume and a weapon against rot. And in most cases, it did something. Vinegar is acidic. It can kill some microbes. It can preserve food. It stings cuts. It burns the nose. It feels like it's working. So when a sponge sat in vinegar all day, the logic followed it must be sanitized. But vinegar has limits, and the sponge was porous, soft, absorbent, perfect for trapping moisture and everything that came with it. When one person used the sponge, they left something behind, tiny things, invisible, clinging to the fibers, waiting, and when the next person used it, those things had a new host. It's easy to see it now. We know the words bacteria, parasites, cross-contamination. We know about sterilization, about boiling, about gloves and soap and bleach. But in Rome, those ideas didn't exist. The sponge didn't need to be thrown out. It just needed a good dip in vinegar. And so the cycle continued. Every day, thousands of Romans filed into public latrines. They sat side by side on stone benches. No stalls, no partitions, just people going about their business in the open air. Some talked, some sang, some read poetry. It was normal, expected. And when they finished, they reached for the sponge. It waited for them in a jar or basin floating gently in sour water. They used it. They rinsed it. They left it. And someone else came in and did the same. Each user unknowingly left behind something more than waste. They left traces of themselves in the fibers of that sponge, and yet no one thought to question it. No one thought to say, maybe we shouldn't all be sharing this. Not because they were careless, but because they trusted tradition, they trusted vinegar. It's a strange thing how civilizations can get so much right and still miss what matters most. The Romans built entire cities from scratch. They understood load distribution, gravity, even rudimentary hydraulics. They designed sewer systems and water pressure valves. They had laws regulating cleanliness in taverns and baths. They even had staff, usually slaves or laborers, tasked with maintaining public toilets and refilling the vinegar basins. But all of it sat atop a belief that smell equaled cleanliness. And that belief, strong and deep-rooted, allowed one tiny mistake to repeat itself over and over again. It wasn't just sponges either. In Roman bathhouses, people shared oils, shared scraping tools, shared benches. The water in the baths was rarely changed. Warm water, standing still, full of bodies, full of possibilities. Illness spread quietly, invisibly. Skin infections, intestinal worms, outbreaks of diarrhea, fevers, mysterious coughing fits. They thought it was the weather, or the gods, or old age. But behind the scenes, their trust in vinegar, their faith in clean enough, was slowly betraying them. There's something deeply human in that. Even today, we do it. We trust what we were told. We repeat habits without asking why. We assume that because it worked before, it must be safe now. But safety is rarely that simple. And in Rome, safety was a smell. A sharp, eye-watering, nose-burning smell. The vinegar was like a ritual, a way to signal that you had done your part, that you were civilized, that you didn't leave the sponge dry, that you didn't leave a mess. You dipped it. You respected the process. You did what was expected. There's a comfort in rituals, even when they don't work. And maybe that's why no one changed it. Because no one wanted to admit that the sponge wasn't clean. To do that would be to question the entire system. The baths, the latrines, the customs of an empire, and in a city like Rome, built on pride and permanence, admitting error was not something people did lightly. So the sponge stayed, the vinegar stayed, the belief stayed. Generation after generation, century after century. The sponge became a symbol not just of hygiene but of trust. Trust in the system. Trust in what had always been. And that trust came with a cost. Archaeologists, when they sift through the remains of Roman latrines, find the truth buried in the soil, fossilized feces, parasite eggs, traces of illness. Evidence that even in the most sophisticated parts of the empire, people were getting sick from the very tools they thought were keeping them clean. It sets a strange contradiction. Rome conquered the known world, but couldn't it conquer a sponge? Because they never saw it as the enemy. It sits easy to laugh now, easy to shake our heads and say, how could they not know? But maybe that SIP's not the right question. Maybe the better question is, what do we still believe that isn't true? What do we use every day, without question, without pause, just because it feels like it should work? What smells clean, but isn't sit? What ancient ideas still linger in modern shapes? The sponge, in its simplicity, forces us to think differently about history. It reminds us that greatness doesn't equal perfection, that brilliance can exist side by side with blindness, that the smartest people in the most advanced cities can still get the basics terribly wrong, all because they trusted something they could smell, instead of something they couldn't see. The Romans didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know that a damp sponge was a breeding ground for infection. They didn't know that vinegar wasn't strong enough to kill what lived inside it. They just knew it was what you were supposed to use. And so they did, over and over again. It's dits, not the sponge itself, that matters. It sets the quiet faith behind it, the confidence that comes with repetition. The way a whole civilization, brilliant and flawed, could rally around a shared belief, even when that belief made them sick. So much of history is like that. Not loud, not obvious, but quiet, soft, like a sponge soaking in vinegar waiting to be used again, and again, and again. Imagine stepping into a vast, echoing hall filled with warm mist. The air is thick with steam and the distant sounds of water lapping against stone. You hear voices, soft echoing chatter, mixed with laughter, slaps of dripping feet on marble, and the gentle trickle of running water. Statues line the walls, their marble faces watching you with frozen calm. Somewhere the scent of herbs drifts by, maybe lavender or thyme, and for a moment it all feels luxurious, civilized, Roman. This is the bathhouse, one of Rome's proudest public institutions, a place of gathering, of routine, of daily cleansing. In a world without showers, this was the center of hygiene. Everyone came here, rich or poor, young or old, senators and slaves, merchants, bakers, gladiators and soldiers. For just a few coins, or sometimes nothing at all, you could bathe like a king. Or so it seemed. Because beneath the polished floors and grand mosaics, beneath the warm water and ritual oils, something else lingered, something most people didn't notice, or chose not to, a quiet layer of filth that floated beneath the surface, because the bathhouse, for all its beauty, was not as clean as it looked. When people arrived, they didn't simply undress and step into the water. First, they would rub themselves with olive oil, not soap. Rome didn't have that yet, at least not the way we know it. Instead, they believed oil helped lift dirt and sweat from the body. After slathering it on, they would take a curved metal tool called a strigil and begin scraping, long, firm strokes from neck to ankle. The strigil would remove the oil, and with it the dirt, dead skin, and anything else clinging to their flesh. But that grime had to go somewhere. It was scraped off into bowls, or onto the floor, or into shared basins. And sometimes, believe it or not, that scraped oil mixed with skin flakes, sweat, and who knows what else was collected and resold. Some believed it had healing properties. Others used it for massage. There are even rumors of gladiator oil being bottled and sold to fans, like a strange oily souvenir from the arena. Then, after scraping, came the plunge. The tepidarium, a warm room to ease into the experience. The caldarium, hotter, steamier, where pores opened and muscles relaxed. And finally, the frigidarium, where cold water snapped you back into alertness. These rooms were grand, vaulted ceilings, columns, echoes of splashing and laughter, but the water, that shimmering pool at the center of the ritual, was rarely changed. There were no filters, no pumps, no chlorine. The water simply sat there day after day, heated by fires beneath the floor, fed by aqueducts, and stirred by dozens, sometimes hundreds of bodies. People sweated in it. They coughed and sneezed. They urinated, sometimes without meaning to, sometimes intentionally. Children splashed. Adults relaxed. Skin particles floated. Oil skimmed the surface like a film. And yet, no one seemed to mind. This was just how it was. They believed the heat cleansed, that sweat carried away illness, that steam opened the body and made it whole again. They had no way of knowing what they were swimming in, no way to see the bacteria, the viruses, the invisible threats hiding in the warmth. To them, it was health, vitality, part of daily life. And to be fair, it wasn't all ignorance. The bathhouse served many purposes. It was a social hub like a coffee shop or gym or community centre. People met friends there, conducted business, shared news. Some brought instruments and played music. Others read aloud from scrolls. You could spend hours in a Roman bath, moving from room to room, sweating, soaking, resting and eating. Yes, eating. Vendors sometimes sold snacks inside. Nuts, fruit, wine. Patrons reclined between dips in the pool, munching and sipping, wiping their hands on their robes, then returning to the water. And in that same water floated bits of oil, bits of food, human skin, sometimes blood, sometimes worse. There were attendants, of course, slaves whose job it was to refill basins, sweep the floors and tend to the fires beneath the floors that heated the rooms. But they didn't sanitize. They didn't drain the pools. The bathhouse was too busy, too constant. The water flowed in and out slowly, if at all. In many places, the same water stayed for days. It was warm, it was inviting, and it was filthy. But to the Romans, it was fine. More than fine, it was essential. They couldn't set to imagine life without it. Some emperors bathed twice a day. Philosophers wrote about the importance of cleansing the body as a way to cleanse the mind. Mothers brought their children. Soldiers bathed before battle. Even the sick came, hoping the steam and oil would drive out illness. And maybe, sometimes it helped. But often, it didn't set. Historians and archaeologists have found evidence of widespread skin infections in the Roman population. Rashes, fungal growths, eye diseases that spread from shared water, intestinal parasites that likely thrived in the warm, moist conditions of bathhouse floors. We know now that moisture breeds bacteria. That warm, standing water is the perfect home for invisible dangers. But they didn't set, no. They trusted the heat. They trusted tradition. Just like with a communal sponge in the toilet, they believed that if everyone did it, it must be safe. That if the emperor bathed here, if the philosopher bathed here, if the priest and the poet and the merchant and the farmer all bathed here, then surely it was clean. And so they kept coming. Every day, stripping down, scraping oil, soaking, sharing everything. The floor tiles were often slippery with a thin layer of grease, the walls damp with steam. In some bathhouses, archaeologists have discovered worn grooves in the stone, places where countless feet stepped, slipped, and stood over generations. And in the drains they found bones, small ones, likely animals, maybe offerings, maybe leftovers. They found combs, jewelry, coins, and sometimes stranger things, personal things, lost things, pieces of lives that slipped away in the water and disappeared. The bathhouse was a living place, constant, breathing, full of bodies, full of sounds, but it was never quiet, and it was never truly clean. There were outbreaks of illness in Rome. Some swept through neighborhoods quickly, quietly, others lasted longer. Fevers, diarrhea, rashes that covered the body. The doctors of the time offered herbs, rituals, and prayers, but no one thought to drain the water. No one suspected the oil, because this was Rome, civilized, advanced, wise, and yet so blind. It's easy now to see the flaws, to imagine the horror of stepping into that water, to feel revulsion, but it's also a reminder, a lesson that even the most brilliant societies can carry blind spots. That we too may trust what is familiar, even when it hides something foul. The Roman bathhouse was not a joke. It was not a failure. It was an attempt, an honest, beautiful attempt to bring people together, to create order, to elevate daily life into something communal, elegant, even spiritual. But it was also a place where sweat and filth mixed, where oil carried more than just dirt, where warm water, left unchanged, became a silent danger. And still, they went, because they didn't know, because it felt right, because it smelled good, because it was what everyone else did. That sips the eerie part. Not the oil, not the water, but the trust, the faith in a system that didn't work the way they thought it did. We remember Rome for its roads, its laws, its conquests. But maybe we should also remember the bathhouse, that warm, echoing room where people gathered not just to bathe, but to believe they were clean, when they were anything but. They smiled just like we do. They laughed. They whispered in crowded rooms. They kissed their lovers and children. They chewed their food, tore bread with their teeth, and washed it down with wine. In portraits carved from marble, Roman citizens are often shown with strong jaws and confident expressions, their mouths closed, their smiles subtle, but behind those sculpted lips was a mouth full of secrets. We often forget this part of history, the quiet daily habits that lived inside the mouth, the things people did every morning, every evening, to keep themselves clean, to freshen their breath, to stay healthy. And in ancient Rome, dental hygiene was important. Not always effective, but important. They cared how their teeth looked. They noticed bad breath. They spoke openly about mouth odors, especially in the context of romance or dinner parties. So they tried. They really did. But what they used, what they believed would protect their teeth, was unlike anything we dare put in our mouths today. Take toothpaste, for example. The Roman version wasn't paste at all. It was a fine, gritty powder, made by grinding crushed bones, ashes, oyster shells, and charcoal into a dusty mix. Sometimes, hooves from animals were added, or burned eggshells, finely ground until nearly invisible to the eye, but sharp to the touch. The idea was simple. The powder would scrub the teeth clean, removing food, stains, and whatever else clung to them. There was no flavor, no mint, no sweeteners, just dust and grit. You'd dip a damp cloth or a finger into the powder and rub it over your teeth. Some used small sticks or brushes made from twigs or animal hair. Others just used their hands. The taste must have been awful. Bitter, chalky, metallic, but it scratched the surface. And that, to them, meant it worked. But it didn't stop there. Some Roman recipes for dental cleaning included something far more unsettling: urine. Yes, human urine. It sounds horrifying now, but in ancient times, urine was believed to have powerful cleansing properties. It contains ammonia, a natural bleaching agent. Romans even imported Portuguese urine, considered especially potent, and used it not only for laundry but sometimes for whitening teeth. It's hard to imagine, but this was considered advanced, scientific even. The Roman poet Catullus once mocked a man for having bright white teeth, accusing him of using too much urine to get them that way. It was a joke, but one rooted in a real practice. They believed that if something stung or tasted strong, it must be cleaning something. And so day after day people rubbed powders on their teeth, and sometimes even rinsed with solutions no modern mouth would tolerate. And then there was mouthwash. Not the minty, alcohol-filled kind we know today, but mixtures made from vinegar, salt, honey, goat's milk, and occasionally more urine. Some formulas included baking soda or myrrh to freshen breath. Others used wine or even blood from certain animals, boiled and cooled. The goal was always the same, to remove bad smells and keep the mouth fresh. But of course, without an understanding of bacteria, the real sources of decay and disease were left untouched. The Romans didn't brush for plaque. They didn't floss. They didn't treat cavities the way we do now. If a tooth ached, it was pulled. If the pain continued, they turned to herbal remedies, spells, or priests. But despite their efforts, Roman mouths were often filled with decay. Archaeologists have found Roman skulls with clear evidence of abscesses, gum disease, and tooth loss. Even among the wealthy, even among the educated. Their powders may have polished the surface, but the damage underneath was never addressed. Bacteria thrived in the gaps. Infection took root below the gum line, and pain was constant. To soothe toothaches, they used strange mixtures: crushed mice, dried lizard, cabbage leaves soaked in vinegar, or poultices made from onions and garlic. These were placed on the jaw, not in the mouth. Others chewed on willow bark, which contains a natural painkiller similar to aspirin. Some blew smoke into the mouth from specific herbs, believing the vapors would drive out the tooth demons. It's easy to laugh at this, to see it as superstition, but think about it. They were working with the knowledge they had. They observed what seemed to help, wrote it down, passed it on. Their intentions were genuine. Their desire for health, real, but the results, often terrifying. And yet they lived so close, so intimately. Romans dined together often, reclining shoulder to shoulder on couches. They dipped bread into shared bowls. They used their hands, not forks. They tore meat with their teeth and passed food from person to person. Families ate like this. Friends, strangers at feasts. The act of eating was communal, intimate, almost sacred. And then came the kisses. Romans greeted close friends with kisses on the cheek, sometimes even the lips. Lovers kissed, of course. Parents kissed their children. It was a culture of closeness, and with each touch, each kiss, each shared bite came the quiet risk of infection. Cold sores, gum disease, mouth ulcers, and more passed silently between them, mouth to mouth, bite to bite, and no one knew. No one imagined that something invisible could live inside a kiss, waiting for its next home. Even the practice of chewing herbs to freshen breath had its risks. They chewed fennel, parsley, mint, and sometimes aniseed, but these only masked the smell. They didn't stop the rot, and so, under all the sweetness, something foul continued to grow. There are records of Roman physicians trying to treat mouth diseases. Some believed that worms lived inside the gums. Others thought toothaches were caused by trapped wind. Their treatments were often brutal, burning, cutting, or bleeding the gums to release the pain. They didn't use anesthesia. They didn't sterilize their tools. They simply did what they thought was right. And yet in marble sculptures and frescoes, Roman smiles remain frozen in time, smooth, unblemished, as if their mouths were perfect. But the truth, buried in bones and forgotten writings, tells another story. A story of crushed bones rubbed across enamel, of sour liquid swirled around aching teeth, of kisses passed without knowing what they carried, of efforts made in earnest, but guided by false hope. It's strange, isn't it, to think that something so simple, keeping your mouth clean, could be so difficult that a civilization capable of building roads that lasted millennia, that crafted law and literature in cities of stone, couldn't protect its own smile. But it also reminds us of something deeply human. We all want to be clean. We all want to be presentable. We all want to be close to the people we love. And in that effort, we sometimes make mistakes. Today, we have toothpaste filled with fluoride. We have floss, antiseptics, electric brushes. We visit dentists, get x-rays, fill cavities, realign crooked teeth. But not so long ago, people just like us were chewing on ash and rinsing with vinegar, doing the best they could with what they had. And maybe, in the silence of history, there's something humbling about that. That, even the Romans, so proud, so powerful, still struggled with the simple act of keeping their breath fresh and their teeth whole. And yet, they smiled. They kissed. They whispered in crowded rooms, just like we do. And that is the strange beauty of history. The streets of Rome never truly slept. Even at night, when torches flickered against marble walls and carts rolled quietly through the narrow alleys, there was movement. The city breathed. It sweated. It leaked. In the day, it roared with the sound of sandals scraping stone, the shouts of merchants and the clatter of hooves on cobbled roads. But underneath it all, hidden just beneath the surface, something else moved. Water, waste, and the slow, endless current of human filth. Rome, the mighty capital of civilization, had sewers, massive ones. Systems that stretched beneath the streets like veins under skin. They called it the Cloaca Maxima, the Great Drain. It was one of the oldest and most impressive engineering feats of its time, wide enough to stand in, strong enough to last thousands of years, and yet, for all its size and ambition, the city still stank. The smell of waste never truly left. It lingered in public latrines, drifted up from the drains, and clung to the air like a ghost. The ancient Romans knew this. They weren't blind to the filth. They walked through the same streets, saw the same puddles, stepped over the same human mess. And so, now and then, rulers tried to fix it. Some emperors issued public hygiene laws, decrees meant to keep the streets clean and the people safe. Fines were introduced for those who dumped trash into alleys or emptied chamber pots onto the road. There were rules against slaughtering animals too close to public spaces, regulations on where waste could be poured and where it couldn't. In theory, Rome had laws for cleanliness. In theory, the city should have sparkled. But in practice, things were different. Because laws are only as strong as those who enforce them, and Rome was vast. Its population swelled to over 1 million people at its peak. With every new building, every new bathhouse, every market stall and tenement, the city grew heavier, louder, dirtier, and no law could hold back the tide. To manage this mess, slaves and laborers were assigned the thankless job of cleaning. They swept the streets, scooped the refuse, and tried, often in vain, to keep the public toilets in working order. In latrines, the same ones where dozens might sit side by side without walls or partitions, these workers emptied waste pits and refilled jars of vinegar for the infamous shared sponge. But they were few, and the mess was many. The work never ended, and the smell never left. The sewers helped, of course. Water from aqueducts fed into the Cloaca Maxima and flushed some of the waste away. The system was gravity-fed, pulling dirty water downhill, out of the city, and eventually into the Tiber River. But even this wasn't enough. Blockages happened. Overflows happened. In poorer neighborhoods where the infrastructure was weak or non-existent, people relieved themselves in alleys, behind buildings, or simply into pots that were later tossed out the window. It wasn't uncommon to walk the streets and see or feel evidence of someone else's business. In the darkness of night, the city came alive with smells. The mixture of sweat, rotting food, animal dung, and human waste formed an aroma that no perfume could mask. Even in the markets, where spices and cooked meats filled the air, the undercurrent of filth remained. And still, the laws persisted. Emperors like Augustus and Hadrian made cleanliness part of civic pride. They rebuilt aqueducts, expanded the sewer systems, and created public fountains to provide clean water. They paid men to clean the streets and tried to restrict the butchers and tanners who dumped blood and chemicals into the drains. But they were fighting a battle they could never fully win. Because Rome was alive, and like all living things, it was messy. Even in the grandest forums and temples, smells crept in through the cracks. Beneath the polished marble and golden statues, the waste of 1,000,000 people flowed like a river no one wanted to see. In wealthier homes, private latrines connected directly to the sewer system. The rich could sit in comfort, away from the public masses, and let the water carry their waste away. But even here, problems persisted. Smells often rose through the pipes, especially in summer, rats too, and the occasional backflow reminded even the elite that no one in Rome was truly separate from the filth. For the poor, the situation was worse. In cramped insulae, apartment blocks that rose 4 or 5 stories, families shared a single latrine or relied on chamber pots. These were dumped into the street or into poorly managed cesspits. And when these overflowed, which they often did, the filth spilled down stairways and through walls, turning entire buildings into damp, disease-ridden traps. There are stories half forgotten now of floods in Rome mixing with sewage, of stormwater running black through the streets, carrying away food, trash and waste, children splashing in puddles that should never have existed, and the city, as always, moving on. Disease followed, of course. Parasites, infections, outbreaks of diarrhea and fevers, but the people didn't understand why. They blamed the gods, the stars, the air. The concept of invisible germs was still over 1,000 years away, so they focused on what they could see and smell. They burned incense. They wore perfumes. Some carried small bouquets of herbs to mask the stench, but the problem remained. Even in the grand public bathhouses, where Romans came to cleanse their bodies, the same cycle continued. Water sat unchanged. Floors grew slick with oil and skin. The waste of many clung to every surface. And when bathers stepped outside wrapped in fresh robes, they walked back into streets lined with filth. The city never stopped trying, though. New rules were passed. More labourers were sent. Taxes were levied to maintain sewers and streets. Some officials, especially during times of plague, ordered mass cleanings or the closure of public latrines. But these efforts were temporary. The next day the filth returned. There's something strangely poetic about it, that the most powerful empire in the world, the one that built roads across continents, that conquered lands from Britain to Egypt, that mapped the stars and wrote the laws, still struggled to manage its own waste. But maybe that's the truth of civilization, that no matter how high we build, how beautifully we decorate, or how strictly we legislate, beneath it all, we are still human, still messy, still leaking, sweating, discarding, and flushing away the parts of life we'd rather not see. Rome's laws were ambitious, and for their time they were advanced. No other ancient city had sanitation on this scale. The Cloaca Maxima was the heartbeat of urban cleanliness, and Roman engineers designed latrines, drains, and fountains with incredible skill. But they were still guessing, still trying to tame nature with stone and law. And nature, as always, pushed back. Even the name cloaca has a certain finality to it. Derived from Latin, it means sewer or drain, but also evokes something more primal, a channel for filth, a place where everything unwanted ends up. And yet, this great sewer, praised by writers like Pliny the Elder, still carried the scent of failure. Not because the engineers failed, not because the laws weren't written, but because no empire, no matter how grand, can fully control what it refuses to understand. The people of Rome did what they could. They washed their hands with sand or vinegar. They burned incense in public spaces. They scolded their neighbours for bad habits. But even the cleanest habits couldn't erase the weight of 1 million people living shoulder to shoulder. And so the laws kept coming. With every new emperor, new decrees, new fines, new efforts to sanitize, to regulate, to clean. But the city was always one step ahead, spilling, spreading, oozing from every crack. The records we have today, carved into stone or written on parchment, speak proudly of these efforts. They list fines for public urination, restrictions on market waste, requirements for maintaining drainage ditches. But the ruins left behind, the grime in the bricks, the stains in the stone, tell a different story. A story of a city always trying, always failing, always moving forward anyway. Because Rome never stopped for filth. It never waited for perfect hygiene. It simply adapted, lived with the smell, smiled through the stench, pretended, perhaps, that it wasn't as bad as it seemed. And that too is a kind of civilization. Not the absence of filth, but the ability to live above it, to build marble temples while stepping over waste, to write laws about where you may dump your trash, even if no one enforces them, to celebrate cleanliness while surrounded by decay. It's a reminder that progress is messy, that even our greatest achievements rise out of dirt, that sewers, for all their smell, are signs of something deeper, the desire to be better, to manage what cannot be erased, to live clean even when the world pushes against it. Rome tried, with its laws, with its workers, with its massive, echoing sewer beneath the city. And maybe in that trying we find something noble, even if the city never stopped smelling like what it truly was. Alive. And human. If you could time travel to the ancient world and visit its greatest civilizations, Egypt, India, Greece and Rome, you'd see pyramids and temples, bustling markets and sacred rivers. You'd hear strange languages and smell incense, spices, animals, sweat, fire. But if you paid close attention, if you watched quietly, you'd also notice something far more personal: how they washed, how they cleaned themselves, how they dealt with the parts of life we rarely speak about, even now. And in that quiet observation, something odd would begin to emerge. A difference, not in what they built or what they believed, but in how they stayed clean. Rome, grand and confident, did things differently. While others focused on privacy, on solitude and on sacredness, the Romans took cleanliness and made it communal, public. They turned the act of relieving oneself, or bathing, or brushing teeth, into something almost social, a performance, shared among strangers. And while other civilizations had their own quirks and customs, none approached hygiene quite the way the Romans did. In ancient Egypt, cleanliness was considered next to godliness. Literally, ritual purity was essential, especially for priests. They shaved their entire bodies to avoid lice. They bathed multiple times a day in cold water, often using natron, a natural salt, to cleanse their skin. Perfumed oils were common, not just for scent, but to moisturize and protect. And when it came to toilets, the wealthy had seated latrines in private chambers, while others used clay pots or communal areas that were regularly emptied. But the difference was this: the act was private, personal, not done side by side with 20 strangers, not spoken of freely, not celebrated as a civic activity. The Egyptians built their civilization around the Nile, a river that gave life, fed the fields, and also carried waste away. But their hygiene was introspective, careful, even spiritual. Meanwhile, in ancient India, water was everything. From the Indus Valley civilization, thousands of years before Rome, cities like Mohenjo-daro were built with drainage systems, wells, and even what may have been early toilets. Some homes had dedicated washing areas. Public bath platforms stood in the center of cities, used not for recreation, but for ritual purification. Cleanliness had deep religious meaning. It wasn't just about the body, it was about the soul. Indian texts from the Vedic period describe washing the hands, mouth, and feet at regular intervals. They used clay, ash, and herbal powders to scrub their skin and teeth, and when nature called, people used water to clean themselves afterward, never cloth, never shared tools. The act was done quietly, away from others, then washed away with flowing water. Modesty, privacy, and purity were intertwined. Then there was Greece, philosophical and elegant. The Greeks believed in moderation, in balancing the body and mind. They bathed often, using cold water to invigorate the senses, or warm water in the gymnasiums after exercise. Olive oil was spread on the skin, then scraped off with a strigil, just like the Romans would later do. But again, the space was different. The Greeks built bathhouses, yes, but they were not as large or as socially central as the Roman thermae. And while Greeks did have public latrines in cities like Athens, they did not promote shared hygiene tools. There is no record of the Greeks using a communal sponge, dipped in vinegar and passed from user to user. They too understood the use of water and clay, and though their philosophy shaped the Roman mind, their approach to cleanliness remained more private, more refined. But then there was Rome. Rome took the idea of public hygiene and turned it into ritual, an event. The bathhouse wasn't just for washing. It was for meeting, for eating, for reading and exercising. Hundreds could gather in one complex, moving from hot rooms to cold ones, sweating, scraping, soaking in water that, more often than not, was not changed for days. The bath became a theatre of the body, and when it came to toilets, they went even further. Imagine a long stone bench, carved with evenly spaced holes. Beneath it, a water channel flowed. Above it, another channel for clean water. No stalls, no walls, just open space. Men and women, depending on the bathhouse, sitting shoulder to shoulder, talking, laughing, passing time while relieving themselves. And when they were done, they reached for a tool known as the tersorium, a sponge tied to a stick, dipped in vinegar or salt water, used to wipe, then returned to the same basin for the next person. The same sponge, used by dozens, maybe hundreds, every day. This practice is found nowhere else in the ancient world. Egypt never embraced it. India never allowed it. Greece never mentioned it. Only Rome institutionalized it, formalized it, trusted it. To the Romans it was normal, logical, a shared solution to a shared problem. But it reveals something deeper about the Roman mind, their faith in infrastructure, in systems, in the idea that what worked for one could work for all. They built aqueducts to feed entire cities, roads to link distant provinces, laws to bind different cultures under one empire. And when it came to cleanliness, they trusted systems too. The sponge was part of that trust, a tool backed by vinegar, shared in the open, used without shame. The sponge didn't just clean, it connected. It made everyone equal. Whether you were a merchant, a soldier, or a senator, you wiped the same way. And therein lies the paradox. Rome was obsessed with cleanliness, but misunderstood what it meant. Their bathhouses were full of bodies, but full of bacteria. Their sponges stung with vinegar, but carried parasites. Their sewer systems were vast, but still left the streets filthy. They wrote laws about hygiene. Emperors fined citizens who dumped waste improperly. Slaves were assigned to scrub latrines. But the real threat, the invisible one, was never addressed, because they couldn't see it, couldn't smell it. And so they trusted what they could: sharp vinegar, smooth marble, and long-standing tradition. Other civilizations, by contrast, turned to nature, the flowing river, the purifying ash, the solitude of silence. Their rituals were gentler, more personal, less dependent on shared tools. And perhaps because of that, they avoided the same pitfalls. It's not that India, Egypt, or Greece were cleaner overall, but they were cautious. Their hygiene reflected their philosophies. and those philosophies emphasized balance, harmony, and respect for what could not be controlled. Rome controlled everything, except its filth. But it tried. Oh, how it tried! With its sewers, its bathhouses, its endless layers of rules and routines. The sponge, the strigil, the public latrine. They were all part of a vast experiment in communal living, an empire that believed it could organize not just armies and provinces, but smells, stains, and the slow, messy business of being human. And maybe that's what makes Rome so fascinating. Not just its victories or monuments, but its contradictions. It taught the world how to build, while quietly proving how little it understood about what needed to be washed away. Rome. The name evokes grandeur, power, civilization itself. Marble columns stretched toward the sky, roads wound across continents, aqueducts carried fresh water into the heart of cities, forums bustled with merchants, philosophers, and politicians, statues gleamed in sunlight, laws governed citizens' behavior, and everywhere, a sense of order prevailed. Rome prided itself on structure, on control, on the ability to shape both land and people. To the outsider it seemed immaculate, clean, advanced, perfect. And yet, when we look closer, the irony becomes impossible to ignore. Because while Rome engineered roads that lasted millennia, invented sewers that carried waste far from the streets, and built baths that could host hundreds of citizens at once, the personal hygiene of Romans was deeply unsettling, shocking. Even a civilization that could move mountains still struggled with the most basic aspects of human cleanliness. The streets themselves were a testament to Roman organization. They were paved straight and marked for traffic. Water flowed through fountains, carried by aqueducts built with precision. Sewers like the Cloaca Maxima funneled human waste away from the heart of the city. On the surface, everything functioned. The city was alive, buzzing with life, commerce, and energy. But beneath that surface, beneath the elegant facades and public order, the truth was messy. The very citizens who prided themselves on hygiene and ritual cleanliness were at the mercy of practices that would horrify modern sensibilities. And it is here the contrast between public perfection and personal chaos that Rome reveals its deepest irony. Consider the public toilets, known as latrines. They were communal, with long stone benches punctuated by evenly spaced holes. No partitions, no privacy, no shame. Men would sit side by side, discussing business or politics while relieving themselves. And then to clean, they would use the infamous tersorium, a sponge attached to a stick, dipped in vinegar or salt water, then returned for the next person to use, a shared tool for intimate cleansing, reused hundreds of times. Think about that. A society that built aqueducts, roads, and walls spanning thousands of miles considered it normal to wipe with a sponge that dozens of strangers had used before you. The irony is palpable. Their engineering genius could move water from distant hills into the city with perfect flow, yet they allowed disease and parasites to travel along a wooden stick with a soaked sponge. The bathhouses, which the Romans viewed as temples of cleanliness, tell a similar story. Men and women bathed side by side in massive pools filled with tepid or hot water. They scrubbed their skin with olive oil and scraped it off with metal strigils, leaving behind a mixture of oil, sweat, and dead skin. The water, however, was rarely changed. Bodies soaked in the same bath for hours, day after day. Vendors sold wine and snacks within the halls. People lounged, ate, conversed, while the water teemed with skin, oils, and who knows what else. The baths were communal, social, and designed to celebrate cleanliness. But ironically, they often spread disease faster than they prevented it. A Roman citizen might leave feeling refreshed and elegant, yet carry within them parasites and bacteria that modern medicine would immediately identify as harmful. Even dental hygiene, a personal and intimate part of daily life, was a lesson in irony. Romans used powders made from crushed bones, oyster shells, and sometimes even urine to clean their teeth. Mouthwashes included vinegar or goat's milk, They chewed herbs for breath, used strigils on their gums, and trusted these methods to maintain oral health. And yet, archaeological evidence reveals widespread tooth decay, gum disease, and abscesses. While Rome built aqueducts to bring clean water to fountains and homes, they could not control the microscopic invaders that thrived in mouths filled with powdered bone and vinegar. The sophisticated treatment of water and streets contrasted sharply with the primitive care or lack thereof given to their own bodies. The laws and regulations Rome enacted further emphasize this contradiction. Emperors passed decrees to maintain public cleanliness, assigned slaves to scrub latrines, and punished those who dumped waste improperly. Sewers were built, aqueducts extended, and fountains maintained to bring hygiene to the masses. Yet, for all this effort, streets remained foul-smelling, latrines remained breeding grounds for disease, and bathhouses continued to circulate contaminated water. Rome had mastered engineering and law, but failed to ensure that these advances translated into effective personal hygiene. They built monuments to their civilization, while simultaneously tolerating practices that, by modern standards, were repulsive. Even social habits contributed to this irony. Romans dined together, sharing platters, passing food from hand to hand. Kissing and close contact were common, even with the knowledge, or at least the suspicion, that mouths carried unseen hazards. The communal sponge, shared baths, and open latrines created a culture where intimacy and hygiene collided in dangerous ways. Romans were sophisticated enough to understand anatomy, engineering, and architecture, yet blind to the consequences of their shared practices. They believed vinegar and soapwater cleansed, that hot water purged the body of disease, that social order could extend to matters of personal care. And yet, these measures, however clever, were largely ineffective. When we compare Rome to other civilizations, the irony deepens. In ancient Egypt, priests shaved their entire bodies to avoid lice and bathed frequently in cold water, using natural salts and oils. In India, ritual purification with water, ash, and herbal powders was central to spiritual life, emphasizing privacy and purity and personal responsibility. Greek citizens, while adopting communal exercise and bathing, did not employ shared sponges for intimate cleaning. Rome, by contrast, elevated communal hygiene to the level of civic pride, creating an infrastructure for shared cleanliness, while simultaneously ignoring the microscopic dangers inherent in such practices. Their engineering, legal structure, and public spaces were advanced beyond their time, but their personal care remained primitive. The very genius of Rome, their ability to systematize and organize, created the conditions for one of the most grotesque ironies in human history: the cleanest streets surrounded by the dirtiest habits. Even the wealthy, who had private latrines and baths within their villas, were not immune. They enjoyed running water and sewage removal, but still participated in communal routines elsewhere, meeting friends in public baths, using public fountains, or dining alongside strangers. Their private hygiene improved comfort, but did not inoculate them from the broader societal practices that continued to spread bacteria and disease. The contrast between their controlled environments and public exposure highlights the dissonance. Rome's civilization was advanced, yet daily life remained riddled with exposures we would now consider dangerous. This irony is not merely historical. It speaks to the nature of human innovation. The Romans built aqueducts to bring life-sustaining water into the city, yet allowed their own citizens to defile and contaminate it almost immediately through shared practices. They created laws to govern behavior, yet the very behaviors they sought to regulate undermined the effectiveness of those laws. They celebrated cleanliness as a civic virtue, but only on a superficial level. Engineering triumphs could not substitute for an understanding of microbiology, nor could public order compensate for flawed personal habits. It is a cautionary tale. Civilization and technology can achieve remarkable feats, but human behavior remains the unpredictable variable. The Cloaca Maxima, perhaps the most famous example, exemplifies this tension, designed to drain sewage from the city. It was an engineering marvel, large enough for a person to walk through. It carried human waste, storm runoff, and industrial byproducts to the Tiber River. Historians marvel at its durability and sophistication. Yet, the very same river became a conduit for disease, a source of contamination, and a vector for illness. Rome's triumphs in construction and urban planning coexisted with a reality in which public hygiene could not match the ambition of public architecture. They mastered stone and water, but neglected the invisible world that thrived within it. And the bathhouses, the so-called temples of cleanliness, remain an equally striking example. Marble floors, hot rooms, cold pools, saunas, exercise areas, even libraries and snack vendors. They represented a culture of health, leisure, and social cohesion, but the water, left stagnant, the communal scraping of oil and sweat, the repeated use of dirty tools, all these elements undercut the very purpose of hygiene. Here, the paradox is at its most visible. Spaces designed to cleanse and relax became incubators for filth, disease, and discomfort. The Romans themselves may have felt invigorated and refreshed after bathing, but the invisible microscopic world thrived nonetheless. Their civilization's pride in cleanliness existed almost entirely at a visible aesthetic level. Even dental care, as strange and unsettling as it appears to us, demonstrates this gap. Teeth were brushed with powdered bones and shells, sometimes with the addition of urine. Mouthwashes included vinegar or goat's milk. The intent was clear: to whiten, freshen, and protect. The knowledge was present, but incomplete. The Romans could manipulate stone, marble, water, and metal, yet they lacked insight into the microscopic forces that shaped oral health. Their accomplishments in architecture and public works dwarfed their understanding of personal biology. The irony lies not only in the contrast, but in the persistence of that contrast. The more advanced Rome became, the more glaring the inadequacy of their hygiene practices appeared. What lessons can we take from this? Perhaps the greatest is that civilization is not simply measured by roads, aqueducts, laws, or buildings. It is also measured by the everyday practices of its citizens, by the intersection of knowledge, behavior, and health. Rome demonstrates that technological and structural mastery can coexist with deeply flawed personal habits, that progress in one area does not guarantee progress in another, that even the most organized, disciplined, and impressive civilizations can be blind to the simplest truths about their own bodies. And yet, for all this irony, there is something human and even admirable about Rome. Their efforts to create public systems, to legislate cleanliness, to provide bathhouses and latrines, to build infrastructure on a scale never before seen, reflect a desire to improve society, to create order, and to elevate daily life. The irony does not negate ambition or ingenuity. It highlights the limits of knowledge in a world without microbiology or germ theory. The Romans tried, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes grotesquely, to impose cleanliness on their civilization, and in that attempt, they created a paradox we still marvel at today: a civilization celebrated for order, law, and infrastructure, yet intimately, horrifyingly flawed in the details of personal hygiene. It is this tension, the juxtaposition of brilliance and repulsion, that makes Rome so endlessly fascinating. Marble and sewage, aqueducts and sponges, vinegar and powdered bone, baths and parasites, laws and overflowing streets. A civilization capable of engineering wonders that outlast millennia, yet trusting a wooden stick and a shared sponge to care for its citizens' most private needs. The world we see today, the streets, the buildings, the technology, often feels far removed from the lives of those who came before us. And yet, when we step quietly into history, when we peel back the layers of time, we begin to see the humanity that lingers beneath. Great civilizations, empires that rose to incredible heights, that built monuments and laws, that conquered lands and inspired awe, also hid aspects of themselves that we would now call repulsive. The public image was one of glory, of grandeur, of refinement, yet underneath that veneer, ordinary life often contained practices that would make even the boldest modern imagination shiver. Ancient Rome, with its aqueducts, marble columns, and sprawling bathhouses, is perhaps the most infamous example. We've spoken of their shared sponges, their communal latrines, their stagnant bathwater, their strange dental powders, yet this was only the surface. Every civilization, no matter how enlightened or advanced, had its own shadowed corners where hygiene, or the lack of it, thrived in secrecy. Take, for instance, the great Egyptians, whose temples and pyramids rise like eternal monuments to their sophistication. Priests shaved their entire bodies, bathed in the Nile, and used natural oils to preserve both skin and health. It seems clean, meticulous, even admirable. Yet in homes and streets, sanitation was not always perfect. Waste was sometimes disposed of in alleys, and smallpox and other infectious diseases were common. Even their revered rivers, which provided life and purification, could become channels for contamination. What is striking is that the grandeur of the monuments, the rituals of daily worship, often concealed the practical challenges of keeping a growing population healthy. Behind the temples, behind the rituals, the ordinary lives of Egyptians were messy, intimate, and often dangerous to their health. In ancient India, purification rituals and the careful use of water were central to spiritual life. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro had complex drainage systems, wells, and public baths that suggest a sophisticated understanding of sanitation, and yet these advances existed alongside crowded housing, shared water sources, and routine exposure to pathogens. The religious significance of cleansing emphasized personal responsibility, but it could not prevent disease from spreading when population density increased. Even with ritual purity guiding behavior, ordinary human habits, sharing spaces, communal living, and proximity to waste meant that the unseen microbial world thrived, invisible yet ever present. Behind the careful rituals, humans continued to struggle with the realities of the body, much like the Romans did centuries later. The Greeks, often celebrated for philosophy, art, and medicine, also had peculiar and occasionally troubling habits. Bathing was a cultural institution, but communal and ritualized. They used olive oil, scraped it off with metal strigils, and believed in moderation and balance. Their diets, athletic practices, and philosophies promoted health, yet disease and parasites remained common. Public latrines existed in Athens, but privacy was minimal, and water access varied by class. Again, the contrast between public achievement and personal practice is evident. The Greeks, like the Egyptians and Indians, excelled at creating systems and ideas, but the simple, intimate act of staying truly clean remained elusive. And then there is Rome, the civilization we have explored most deeply. The communal sponge, the bathhouses teeming with bodies, the strange dental powders, the sewers that carried waste, yet failed to prevent exposure. All these elements highlight the deep irony of a society that could organize the known world yet was so primitive in caring for the self. But even this is only part of the picture. Romans were inventive, social, and confident, yet their daily routines, repeated over centuries, carried risks invisible to their eyes. Their grand architecture and ambitious infrastructure created an impression of perfection that masked the more unpleasant realities of personal hygiene. They were an empire of contradictions, advanced and primitive, proud and careless, brilliant and grotesque. It is this tension that makes them so endlessly fascinating. But the story does not end with Rome. Every civilization hides its own shadows. The Mayans, for example, built towering pyramids, developed advanced calendars, and charted the movements of the stars. Yet in their cities, sanitation was rudimentary. Latrines were limited, and evidence suggests that open defecation was common in some areas. Rivers carried waste, creating zones where disease could spread quickly. Temples and plazas reflected the height of intellectual and architectural achievement, while daily life was still at the mercy of biology. In this too we see the pattern: what is visible to the world, the triumphs of civilization, often conceals the mundane and sometimes grotesque realities of survival. Even in China, where dynasties built monumental walls, palaces and canals, and where water management was sophisticated, personal hygiene could be precarious. Records indicate that public toilets existed, often near markets, and chamber pots were commonplace in homes. Waste management varied by region and era, and diseases like dysentery and cholera were widespread. Emperors could command armies and construct vast irrigation systems, yet daily practices of ordinary people remained a challenge for civilization to control. The grandeur of dynastic China, much like Rome or Egypt, hid the messy and intimate truths of human life. The Iron Age and medieval societies that followed were no different. They built castles, cathedrals, and towns with careful planning, yet their latrines, streets, and water systems were often inadequate. Filth accumulated under windows, rivers carried sewage, and bathing was irregular. The powerful could create order in stone and law, but controlling the messy realities of millions of bodies proved impossible. Across continents, across centuries, the story repeats itself. Civilizations rise, people achieve great things, and yet something as simple as staying clean remains a struggle. Every empire, no matter how brilliant, had to negotiate this intimate, invisible battle. The world we see today, the streets, the buildings, the technology, often feels far removed from the lives of those who came before us. And yet, when we step quietly into history, when we peel back the layers of time, we begin to see the humanity that lingers beneath. Great civilizations, empires that rose to incredible heights, that built monuments and laws, that conquered lands and inspired awe, also hid aspects of themselves that we would now call repulsive. The public image was one of glory, of grandeur, of refinement, yet underneath that veneer, ordinary life often contained practices that would make even the boldest modern imagination shiver. Ancient Rome, with its aqueducts, marble columns, and sprawling bathhouses, is perhaps the most infamous example. We've spoken of their shared sponges, their communal latrines, their stagnant bathwater, their strange dental powders, yet this was only the surface. Every civilization, no matter how enlightened or advanced, had its own shadowed corners where hygiene, or the lack of it, thrived in secrecy. Take, for instance, the great Egyptians, whose temples and pyramids rise like eternal monuments to their sophistication. Priests shaved their entire bodies, bathed in the Nile, and used natural oils to preserve both skin and health. It seems clean, meticulous, even admirable. Yet in homes and streets, sanitation was not always perfect. Waste was sometimes disposed of in alleys, and smallpox and other infectious diseases were common. Even their revered rivers, which provided life and purification, could become channels for contamination. What is striking is that the grandeur of the monuments, the rituals of daily worship, often concealed the practical challenges of keeping a growing population healthy. Behind the temples, behind the rituals, the ordinary lives of Egyptians were messy, intimate, and often dangerous to their health. In ancient India, purification rituals and the careful use of water were central to spiritual life. The Indus Valley cities of Mohenjo-Daro had complex drainage systems, wells, and public baths that suggest a sophisticated understanding of sanitation, and yet these advances existed alongside crowded housing, shared water sources, and routine exposure to pathogens. The religious significance of cleansing emphasized personal responsibility, but it could not prevent disease from spreading when population density increased. Even with ritual purity guiding behavior, ordinary human habits, sharing spaces, communal living, and proximity to waste meant that the unseen microbial world thrived, invisible yet ever present. Behind the careful rituals, humans continued to struggle with the realities of the body, much like the Romans did centuries later. The Greeks, often celebrated for philosophy, art, and medicine, also had peculiar and occasionally troubling habits. Bathing was a cultural institution, but communal and ritualized. They used olive oil, scraped it off with metal strigils, and believed in moderation and balance. Their diets, athletic practices, and philosophies promoted health. Yet disease and parasites remained common. Public latrines existed in Athens, but privacy was minimal, and water access varied by class. Again, the contrast between public achievement and personal practice is evident. The Greeks, like the Egyptians and Indians, excelled at creating systems and ideas, but the simple, intimate act of staying truly clean remained elusive. And then there is Rome, the civilization we have explored most deeply. The communal sponge, the bathhouses teeming with bodies, the strange dental powders, the sewers that carried waste, yet failed to prevent exposure. All these elements highlight the deep irony of a society that could organize the known world yet was so primitive in caring for the self. But even this is only part of the picture. Romans were inventive, social, and confident, yet their daily routines, repeated over centuries, carried risks invisible to their eyes. Their grand architecture and ambitious infrastructure created an impression of perfection that masked the more unpleasant realities of personal hygiene. They were an empire of contradictions, advanced and primitive, proud and careless, brilliant and grotesque. It is this tension that makes them so endlessly fascinating. But the story does not end with Rome. Every civilization hides its own shadows. The Mayans, for example, built towering pyramids, developed advanced calendars, and charted the movements of the stars. Yet in their cities, sanitation was rudimentary. Latrines were limited, and evidence suggests that open defecation was common in some areas. Rivers carried waste, creating zones where disease could spread quickly. Temples and plazas reflected the height of intellectual and architectural achievement, while daily life was still at the mercy of biology. In this too we see the pattern: what is visible to the world, the triumphs of civilization, often conceals the mundane and sometimes grotesque realities of survival. Even in China, where dynasties built monumental walls, palaces, and canals, and where water management was sophisticated, personal hygiene could be precarious. Records indicate that public toilets existed, often near markets, and chamber pots were commonplace in homes. Waste management varied by region and era, and diseases like dysentery and cholera were widespread. Emperors could command armies and construct vast irrigation systems, yet daily practices of ordinary people remained a challenge for civilization to control. The grandeur of dynastic China, much like Rome or Egypt, hid the messy and intimate truths of human life. The Iron Age and medieval societies that followed were no different. They built castles, cathedrals, and towns with careful planning, yet their latrines, streets, and water systems were often inadequate. Filth accumulated under windows, rivers carried sewage, and bathing was irregular. The powerful could create order in stone and law, but controlling the messy realities of millions of bodies proved impossible. Across continents, across centuries, the story repeats itself. Civilizations rise, people achieve great things, and yet something as simple as staying clean remains a struggle. Every empire, no matter how brilliant, had to negotiate this intimate, invisible battle. It is tempting to imagine ourselves above these practices, to feel a sense of superiority, because modern plumbing, soap, and medicine have changed the rules. But the deeper truth is humbling. Civilization, no matter how sophisticated, has always been a negotiation with nature, with biology, with human behavior. Rome's communal sponges, Egypt's crowded homes, India's shared bathing rituals, Greece's public latrines, all of these illustrate a fundamental tension: human ingenuity and human vulnerability, coexisting uneasily. What is glorious on the surface often hides the gross unseen struggles beneath. And so we arrive at the present, sitting on our own toilets, surrounded by running water, plumbing, and privacy. We flush, wash, and carry on, perhaps unaware of the centuries of trials, failures, and innovations that brought us here. And yet, curiosity persists. We wonder, as we look back, what other strange, grotesque, or shocking habits our ancestors indulged in. hidden behind their monumental achievements. What did ordinary life smell like in a Mayan city? What pathogens filled the air of an ancient Egyptian market? How many invisible threats lurked in Greek baths while philosophers debated the nature of existence? The mind cannot help but wonder, imagining the tactile, sensory experiences of lives lived without the hygiene we take for granted today. Perhaps it is this combination, the beauty and the horror, that keeps history compelling. Civilizations, no matter how advanced, are human, and human bodies are imperfect, unpredictable, and vulnerable. The grand achievements, the towering architecture, the innovations in law, engineering, and art, they all coexist with the mundane, intimate, and sometimes repulsive realities of daily existence. The very act of sitting in a bath, of using a tool for cleaning, of eating or drinking in a public space, could carry unseen danger, and yet life went on. The empire marched forward. People adapted, they laughed, they conversed, they built, they survived. Somehow they survived, even in conditions that would horrify us. So the next time you pause in a quiet moment, sitting on your toilet, washing your hands, or taking a shower, reflect on this. You are part of a lineage of humans who have struggled with the same biological realities for millennia. And yet, your circumstances are immeasurably improved. Plumbing, soap, clean water, and private spaces make the act of hygiene routine, simple, even mundane. You are spared the communal sponges, the stagnant bath water, the powders of bone and vinegar, the crowded streets lined with waste. You are, in a sense, fortunate to live in an era where the grotesque aspects of daily life have been mitigated by knowledge, infrastructure, and science. And yet, curiosity remains. Because history is never just about the monuments, it is about the lives, the bodies, and the habits that built them. And what other hidden truths linger, waiting to be discovered? What forgotten customs, strange practices, or shocking routines might lie buried in the ruins of the past, just beyond our current understanding? For every Rome there was a forgotten city. For every Egypt, a private habit concealed beneath temple walls. For every India, a practice known only to the individual. Archaeology, ancient texts, and fragments of material culture reveal glimpses, but rarely the full picture. Our understanding is always partial, incomplete, tantalizingly close, yet forever out of reach. It is this incompleteness that fuels curiosity and keeps the mind wandering into the shadows of history, imagining what life was like, layer by layer, smell by smell, action by action. And so, as we close this chapter, let us leave with one final thought, creepy, unsettling, yet strangely comforting. The next time you sit on a toilet, pause for a moment and think you are spared. You are part of a world that has learned from the mistakes, the grotesque habits, and the peculiar innovations of civilizations long past. You have privacy, clean water, soap, a flush, a barrier between you and the messy realities of human life that existed for millennia before. And yet, the imagination cannot help but wonder, what if you had lived in Rome, in a crowded latrine shoulder to shoulder with strangers, reaching for a sponge soaked in vinegar, never knowing who used it before you? What if you had shared a bath, scrubbed with oil that had touched dozens of bodies before yours, or brushed your teeth with powders that carried the essence of countless others? The mind recoils at the thought, the body shivers, and the story lingers in memory, like the faintest echo of an ancient communal stench that refuses to be forgotten. History, in the end, is full of these paradoxes. Greatness exists alongside horror, beauty alongside grotesque, engineering alongside filth. Rome, Egypt, India, Greece. They all remind us that human civilization is never perfect, never fully in control. And yet, they also remind us of resilience, ingenuity, and the drive to improve, however imperfectly. There is a lesson here, subtle but profound. The more we learn, the more we appreciate what we have. The more we explore the forgotten, the strange and the gross, the richer our understanding becomes, not just of the past, but of ourselves. So continue to wonder, continue to imagine the smells, the textures, the routines that shaped lives long ago. Explore the strange and the forgotten, the shocking and the disgusting. Let curiosity guide you through the ruins of civilizations, across continents and centuries, through the intimate, hidden habits that history often conceals. And as you do, remember the irony, the humanity, and the lessons woven through every latrine, every bathhouse, every sponge, and every street. For the past is never just a story of monuments, it is the story of lives lived, messy, imperfect, and deeply human. And finally, remember this. The next time you sit on a toilet, just be glad you didn't live in Rome. For those who are curious, for those who wish to peer further into the shadows of history, there is always more to uncover, more strange facts, more forgotten habits, more lessons waiting quietly in the annals of time. Ancient civilizations have much to teach us, not only about their achievements, but about their humanity, their contradictions, and the bizarre, intimate realities they hid behind the grandeur of their glory.